Have you ever been flying into a larger airport and been asked to keep your speed up?
Number 2 Echo, maintain your best forward air speed until maximal.
In this video, we're going to talk about the implications of that request and how you might be prepared to do it safely. I'm James Sloan, a professional pilot and flight instructor, and my goal with this channel is to share some lessons with you that I've learned in my over 20 years of flying experience as a pilot and flight instructor. At larger airports, the type of airports that have a lot of jet traffic, there's a need to sequence airplanes to the airport, and there's a controller whose job it is to do that sequencing. When you fly to one of these airports in a smaller piston airplane like a Cessna, you're usually a good bit slower than the other airplanes, and it presents a challenge for the controller to fit you into the flow of airplanes. Speed is one lever that the controller uses, along with radar vectors, to create the spacing and the flow that he needs to sequence you into the airport. So here's an example. During the early stages of the COVID pandemic, I went out and flew an approach at the San Francisco International Airport. It wasn't as busy as it was during normal times, but it was still busy enough that the controller had to sequence me into the flow of airplanes. So here you can watch as I fly the approach. You hear the controller telling other airplanes to maintain a certain speed to the final approach fix, axial or Duyet, depending on which runway. He's telling most of them to maintain 180 knots.
American 1844, cleared ILS, runway 28 right, maintain 180 knots or greater until axial.
And he's vectoring me around to try to figure out where he can sequence me into the flow of airplanes.
Number 2 Echo Echo, fighting 220, maintain 3000.
220 and 3000, 182 Echo Echo.
Delta 527, reduced to 210 knots.
010 knots, Delta 527.
Eventually, when he turns me onto the approach, he clears me for the approach, and then he tells me to maintain my best forward airspeed.
Number 2 Echo Echo, you're 7 miles from maximal, fighting 250, maintain 2500 until established on localizer, cleared for ILS, runway 28 right approach.
Okay, heading 250, maintain 2500 till established, cleared ILS 28 right, 182 Echo Echo.
Number 2 Echo Echo, maintain your best forward air speed until axial.
Best forward, we should be able to do 140 plus, 182 Echo Echo.
Okay, sounds good, thank you.
So how do you know when you receive a request to keep your speed up, how fast you can safely fly an approach? Well, one way to know is to go out and practice it with a flight instructor or with a safety pilot, and that's what I decided to do. I decided to fly out to an airport in Central California that had a very long runway. The airport is the Castle Airport near Atwater, California. It's out in the Central Valley. It used to be an Air Force base during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It was home to a B-52 squadron at one point, and as a result, it has an 11,800 foot long runway. It's also the home of the Castle Air Museum, which is a really cool air museum if you have the time and you're nearby. A great museum to go visit. So why do I think this is something you should practice before you do it at a busy airport? Well, there are a number of hazards that come along with flying an approach faster than you're used to and faster than the approach speed for the aircraft. The most obvious of which is everything's happening faster. In this airplane, I was flying a Cessna 182. The normal approach speed is about 90 knots. I decided to fly the approach at 140 knots, which means everything's going to be happening at least 1.5 times faster. That's going to make it harder for me to stay on the lateral path and the vertical path for the approach, and it's also just that much farther ahead of the airplane that I need to be. A second hazard associated with flying the approach faster is your descent rate will increase. On a standard ILS, you'll be flying a 3-degree descent, which is 318 feet per nautical mile, and that doesn't change with your airspeed or your ground speed, but what does change as you fly faster is your descent rate. At that 3 degrees and 90 knots, you'll be descending at about 480 feet per minute. But if you speed up to 150 knots, you'll be descending at 800 feet per minute in order to stay on the same glide path. That higher descent rate starts to get close to the maximum that the FAA and many airlines consider to be stabilized. They consider 1,000 feet per minute to be the highest rate that you should be descending in order to be considered stabilized. And if you end up a little bit above the glide slope, you might have to descend faster than 1,000 feet per minute to catch up with the glide slope. That can lead to spatial disorientation if you're in the clouds, and it's not considered stabilized. Another hazard is it might be uncomfortable for your passengers. They might start to experience some discomfort from a steep approach. A third hazard associated with flying the approach faster is if you don't slow down, you're going to use a lot more runway. Consider the case of my Cessna 182. Normally you would come over the threshold going 60 to 65 knots and you would touch down well within the touchdown zone. In my case, we decided to come over the threshold going 120 knots, and you'll see that it causes us to use a lot more runway. Now, how do we know how much runway we're using? There are a couple of ways we'll know. One of them is based on the markings on the pavement. So if you look here in AC 150, it gives the dimensions for the markings on the pavement, and you'll see that we have touchdown zone markings every 500 feet, starting with a set of 3 stripes on each side at 500 feet down the runway. Then we have a big set of solid white markers 1,000 feet down the runway called the aiming point markers. And then after that, every 500 feet, we have a set of stripes until the end of the touchdown zone. After the end of the touchdown zone, we don't have any more touchdown zone markings, but we can use the centerline stripes. Centerline stripes on a standard runway are 120 feet long, and the space between the stripes is 80 feet long. So every stripe and space accounts for 200 feet. And in this way, we can count as I fly down the runway and see how much runway we've used. So let's take a look at this on this approach to Castle that I flew. I flew the approach at 140 knots. Here as I come over the stopway and over the threshold, I'm slowing through 125 knots. There's my first set of touchdown markers at 500 feet. There's the aiming point markers at 1,000 feet. There's 1,500 feet, 2,000 feet, 2,500 feet, and the end of the touchdown zone is 3,000 feet, so I'll add 200 per stripe, 3,200, 3,400, 3,600, 3,800, 4,000, 4,200, 4,400. So I touched down 4,400 feet down the runway. Now, a second way you can know how far down the runway you are is by looking at these black signs on the side of the runway that tell you how much runway is remaining. And you can look here as I start to flare and touch down. Over on the left side of the runway, there's a black sign with a white number 7. And that sign means I have 7,000 feet of runway remaining. Now, it's an 11,800 foot runway. If I have 7,000 feet remaining, they're somewhat over 4,000 feet behind me, 4,800 feet behind me. Now with a runway this long, I felt very comfortable doing this exercise, 11,800 feet, and as you can see, I still had 7,000 feet of runway remaining. But at other airports, even airports like San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, John Wayne Orange County Airport, their runways are a good bit shorter, and if you're landing from an ILS or an LPV approach, you're already planning to land 1,000 feet down the runway on or maybe even after the aiming point markers. So at airports like that even, you still have to be careful flying an approach this fast, even though it seems like a longer runway than you're used to. A final hazard associated with flying an approach fast is you might be tempted to try to land the airplane at too high an airspeed, by which I mean force the airplane onto the ground instead of letting it settle onto the ground. And the risk of doing that is you won't be in the right pitch attitude for the airplane to land. You'll land flat or you'll land on the nose wheel. You'll risk bouncing, and you might enter what's called a pilot-induced oscillation, or a porpoise, which is where you bounce down the runway at increasing amplitude until eventually you land hard on the nose wheel, collapse the nose wheel, strike the prop, and do $100,000 or more worth of damage to the airplane. So that's something we want to avoid, and the way that we avoid that is we have to round out close to the runway and be very patient and let the airplane bleed off airspeed as we increase the pitch attitude until we're in the correct pitch for landing. We've got the nose wheel protected, and then we can let the airplane settle onto the runway. And you can see that I do that here. I fly down into ground effect, I level off, I round out, I fly down the runway, I bleed off airspeed, I add flaps, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you do at 5 feet off the runway, but it's one way to slow down. I added the flaps, and I bled off airspeed until I was in the correct attitude to land. And in fact, you can hear the stall warning horn sound as I allow the plane to settle onto the runway. Now, I allowed that to happen, and it took 4,000 feet of runway. So I would suggest giving yourself time and knowing how much distance it will take you to slow down to the correct speed as you approach the runway. Maybe give yourself a half mile, a mile to slow down, and that will still help air traffic control, but it'll allow you not to use thousands of feet of extra runway and not to have this risk of porpoising the airplane down the runway. Now, if you're working on your private pilot certificate or on your instrument rating, this exercise is probably not on the critical path for you getting to your certificate or rating. Once you've completed the certificate or rating though, it might be an interesting exercise to go out with an instructor and practice this and see how quickly you can safely fly an approach. You will need to learn your capabilities, learn the capabilities of your airplane, figure out how much distance you need to slow down if you're flying the approach fast, so that you can still slow to a safe speed over the runway, touch down in the touchdown zone, and not run the risk of porpoising. I hope you enjoyed this video talking about some lessons I've learned from my flying experience. If you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up or subscribe to my channel. Thanks for joining.